Hey there, how's it going? I hope you're doing great. I'm your storyteller and I'm here to take you deep into some chilling horror tales, straight from the dark side of roommates. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel and smash that like button. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, so drop it in the comments. When you're ready, find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, relax. And let's step into the shadows together. It began with the fog rolling in from the sea, a heavy, unnatural blanket that swallowed the horizon and blurred the line between land and water. Most coastal towns lived with fog as a quiet companion, but in Raven's Hollow, the fog was not a companion, it was a warning. Locals had learned long ago to lock their doors before nightfall, to keep their lamps dim, and to never, under any circumstance, answer the whispers that drifted in with the mist. Outsiders who visited rarely stayed long. Some claimed the fog had a taste to it, metallic, like rust and saltwater mixed. Others swore they saw shapes moving within it, tall, indistinct figures that vanished when stared at too long. But most disturbing of all were the voices. The village was nearly forgotten by the outside world, sitting on a jagged stretch of the New England coastline where the cliffs crumbled into the sea. The road that once led into town was cracked and overgrown, rarely traveled except by delivery trucks bringing supplies. Only a handful of families remained, the last descendants of a community that once thrived on fishing and shipbuilding. Their boats sat rotting in the harbor now, blackened wood eaten away by salt and time. No one fished these waters anymore. The sea had taken too much already. It was late autumn when the strangers arrived, drawn by curiosity more than anything else. There were 4 of them: Daniel, a journalist chasing whispers of forgotten American towns; Claire, a photographer who had an eye for ruin and decay; Marcus, a history professor fascinated by unsolved mysteries; and Emily, Daniel's younger sister, who had tagged along reluctantly, though she carried her own secret reasons for coming. They had heard rumors of Raven's Hollow, stories passed down in hushed tones on internet forums and half-forgotten local legends. A town where people had disappeared, where no new children had been born in decades, and where every night the fog rose to smother the village in silence. When their car rolled into town, the first thing they noticed was how empty it felt. Houses stood with shutters closed, their paint peeling and roofs sagging under years of neglect. The streets were narrow and crooked, laid in uneven cobblestones that glistened faintly with the mist already creeping in. A church steeple rose in the distance, its bell long rusted into silence. Only a few villagers could be seen, moving quickly from one place to another, their heads down, their faces pale. None of them greeted the newcomers. None of them even looked directly at them. Daniel parked near what seemed to be the only inn, a weathered building with faded letters barely spelling out, Harbor Rest. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old smoke. An old woman behind the counter eyed them warily, her lips pressed tight. She gave them rooms but no welcome, and when Daniel asked if she had lived there long, she muttered only, "Too long," before handing him the keys. That night, as the fog rolled in, they heard it for the first time. The voices. It began as a low hum, almost like the sound of wind moving through the cracks of the windows. But soon it grew clearer, fragments of words, distant cries, laughter that didn't belong. Emily froze at her window, staring out into the white blur beyond. She could swear she saw shapes moving between the houses, slow and deliberate. Claire tried to record the sound on her phone, but the device only captured static, though she swore the voices were as clear as if someone stood whispering just behind her ear. By morning, the fog had lifted, leaving the town quiet and eerily normal again. The villagers moved about their day as if nothing had happened. When Daniel asked about the fog, the old woman at the inn shook her head violently and told him not to speak of it. "It listens," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the window. "It always listens." Marcus, intrigued, began asking questions of the townsfolk. Most ignored him, but one old fisherman finally muttered that the fog had been there for generations, long before the town itself. "It comes from the sea," he said, his voice cracking. "It brings back what the sea has taken." The dead do not rest here. They walk in the fog. That evening, against the innkeeper's warnings, the group ventured outside after dark. Cameras in hand, they followed the cobblestone streets down toward the harbor, where the fog was thickest. The boats sat as black silhouettes against the water, and the air was heavy with the scent of brine and decay. Then came the voices again, closer this time, unmistakable. Claire's hand shook as she snapped photos blindly into the mist, her flash briefly illuminating figures standing at the end of the pier. When the light faded, the pier was empty. But Emily didn't move. She stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. "I heard her," she whispered. "I heard Mom." Daniel felt his stomach twist. Their mother had drowned years ago in a boating accident, her body never recovered from the ocean. Emily had been only a teenager then, and she had never forgiven the sea for what it stole. Now, here in Raven's Hollow, she swore she heard her mother's voice calling her name from the fog. Marcus insisted they return, but Emily refused to leave. She stepped closer to the mist, her breath visible in the cold air. The voices swelled, overlapping, a chorus of the lost. Hands, pale, waterlogged hands, reached briefly from the fog before vanishing again. Daniel grabbed his sister and dragged her back toward the inn, her screams echoing through the night. Back in their rooms, shaken and pale, none of them could sleep. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the whispers never ceased. By dawn, Claire discovered something chilling in her camera. The photos she had taken at the pier showed not emptiness, but dozens of figures standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces swollen and gray, their eyes hollow voids. And among them was a woman she recognized from Daniel's family photo. A woman with Emily's same smile, standing in the mist with arms outstretched. The discovery in Claire's photographs left the group shaken to their core. Daniel stared at the image of his mother, standing among the drowned, her hollow eyes fixed directly at the camera lens. It was impossible, she had been gone for over 15 years. Yet the detail was undeniable, every strand of her dark hair, the familiar curve of her smile twisted into something mournful. Emily clutched the photo to her chest, refusing to let go, her knuckles white as she whispered, "She's here, she's been here all this time." Sleep became impossible after that night. The voices grew stronger with each passing evening, no longer confined to the fog outside but seeping into their dreams, their thoughts. Marcus began scribbling frantically into his notebook, piecing together fragments of folklore he had unearthed from the villagers. The hollow, it seemed, had been cursed long before the settlement existed. Fishermen had once spoken of a bargain made with something in the sea, something that promised bountiful harvests of fish and safe waters in exchange for silence and obedience. For a time, the village had prospered, but bargains with the sea were never meant to last forever. Eventually, the ocean claimed its debt, first in ships, then in lives, and finally in souls. Claire, once eager for haunting images, now found herself terrified of her own camera. Every photo she took seemed to reveal more figures than her eyes had seen. Sometimes she captured familiar faces. Men and women in modern clothing who bore uncanny resemblances to villagers who had simply vanished in the last decades. Sometimes the figures were older, dressed in tattered garments from centuries past, their eyes glazed as though still drowning. And always, somewhere in the crowd, stood the shape of Daniel and Emily's mother, reaching, waiting. Emily grew restless, slipping out of the inn at night despite Daniel's desperate attempts to stop her. He found her wandering near the cliffs, her bare feet scratched by stone, her voice hoarse as she whispered into the fog. "She's calling me," she would insist. "If I just go to her, maybe I can bring her back." The more Daniel tried to hold her back, the more she resisted, her eyes clouded with a strange devotion, as though the fog had rooted inside her mind. The villagers avoided the outsiders more than ever. Doors slammed shut at their approach, shutters drawn tight. The only one willing to speak was the old fisherman, who warned Marcus in hushed tones that once the fog called your name, you could never escape it. "It doesn't let go," he muttered, his weathered hands shaking as he lit a pipe. It's not your loved ones you hear. It wears their voices, wears their faces. It knows your grief, your guilt, your secrets. That's how it pulls you under. But Marcus, ever the scholar, pressed further. He asked about the church, the abandoned building that loomed at the heart of the village. Its windows were boarded, its bell silent, yet every villager's gaze seemed to flick nervously toward it whenever the fog rolled in. Finally, the fisherman relented, his eyes clouding with memory. That's where they tried to stop it, he said. The priests, the villagers, they built wards, carved runes into the stone, prayed day and night. But the sea is older than prayers. It broke them. It always breaks them. That night, Daniel, Claire, Marcus, and Emily ventured into the church, lanterns casting pale circles of light onto the cracked stone walls. The air smelled of mildew and salt. Strange carvings marred the altar, spirals and jagged shapes that seemed to twist when stared at too long. On the floor, half buried beneath debris, Marcus uncovered what looked like a journal, its leather warped and pages brittle. As he carefully turned them, he read aloud the scrawled words of a priest long gone. The writing spoke of a ritual to seal the fog, to bind it back to the sea, but the ritual required a sacrifice, a soul willingly given to the depths. The last entry ended abruptly, ink smeared by what looked like water stains. Emily's eyes burned as she listened. She clutched Daniel's arm and whispered, "If that's what it takes, maybe that's why Mom is still here. Maybe she was supposed to be the sacrifice." Her voice trembled. Caught between despair and a dangerous hope. Daniel pulled her close, terrified by the thought forming behind her words. The fog thickened around the church, pressing against the boarded windows, seeping through cracks. The voices swelled until they shook the wooden beams, a cacophony of laughter, cries, and whispers overlapping in an unbearable chorus. The lanterns flickered, threatening to die. And then, in the dim light, they saw figures moving in the aisles, translucent shapes, soaked and shivering, their faces pale masks of anguish. Claire lifted her camera instinctively, but Daniel grabbed her hand, forcing it down. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't give it more." The figures drew closer, their eyes fixed on Emily. Among them was the unmistakable form of their mother, her lips forming words they couldn't hear. Emily reached out, tears streaming down her face, her hand trembling as it hovered in the air. For a moment, it seemed the figure smiled at her, a warmth in the cold. But then its mouth opened wider, splitting unnaturally, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The smile twisted into a scream that rattled the stained glass, though no sound came. Marcus pulled Emily back just as the fog surged into the church, extinguishing their lanterns. In the darkness, hands brushed against their skin, wet, cold, insistent. They fled blindly through the pews, crashing into splintered wood until they burst through the doors back into the night. The fog swirled around them, thicker than ever, yet somehow they found their way back to the inn, gasping, shivering, hearts pounding. The innkeeper was waiting, her eyes filled with a sorrowful knowing. She said nothing as they stumbled inside, but later, when the others had collapsed into uneasy sleep, she pulled Daniel aside. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Take your sister, take your friends, and go before it chooses you. Every year it takes more. Every year the sea hungers. Once it sees you, once it calls you by name, you can never run far enough." Daniel wanted to believe her, to pack their bags and flee the cursed village. But when he looked at Emily, pale and restless even in her sleep, he knew it wasn't that simple. The fog already had her. And if he left, it would take her completely. The next day, the group argued. Marcus insisted they had to stay, to uncover the truth, to finish what the priest had started. Claire wanted to leave immediately, haunted by the images burned into her. Caught between despair and a dangerous hope. Daniel pulled her close, terrified by the thought forming behind her words. The fog thickened around the church, pressing against the boarded windows, seeping through cracks. The voices swelled until they shook the wooden beams, a cacophony of laughter, cries, and whispers overlapping in an unbearable chorus. The lanterns flickered, threatening to die. And then, in the dim light, they saw figures moving in the aisles, translucent shapes, soaked and shivering, their faces pale masks of anguish. Claire lifted her camera instinctively, but Daniel grabbed her hand, forcing it down. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't give it more." The figures drew closer, their eyes fixed on Emily. Among them was the unmistakable form of their mother, her lips forming words they couldn't hear. Emily reached out, tears streaming down her face, her hand trembling as it hovered in the air. For a moment, it seemed the figure smiled at her, a warmth in the cold. But then its mouth opened wider, splitting unnaturally, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The smile twisted into a scream that rattled the stained glass, though no sound came. Marcus pulled Emily back just as the fog surged into the church, extinguishing their lanterns. In the darkness, hands brushed against their skin, wet, cold, insistent. They fled blindly through the pews, crashing into splintered wood until they burst through the doors back into the night. The fog swirled around them, thicker than ever, yet somehow they found their way back to the inn, gasping, shivering, hearts pounding. The innkeeper was waiting, her eyes filled with a sorrowful knowing. She said nothing as they stumbled inside, but later, when the others had collapsed into uneasy sleep, she pulled Daniel aside. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Take your sister, take your friends, and go before it chooses you. Every year it takes more. Every year the sea hungers. Once it sees you, once it calls you by name, you can never run far enough." Daniel wanted to believe her, to pack their bags and flee the cursed village. But when he looked at Emily, pale and restless even in her sleep, he knew it wasn't that simple. The fog already had her. And if he left, it would take her completely. The next day, the group argued. Marcus insisted they had to stay, to uncover the truth, to finish what the priest had started. Claire wanted to leave immediately, haunted by the images burned into her camera, certain that if she stayed another night, she would lose her mind. Daniel was torn, his protective instinct for Emily clashing with his fear. Emily herself was resolute, she refused to go. She claimed she could hear her mother even in daylight now, her voice clearer than ever. That evening, as the sun sank and the fog began its crawl inland, Emily disappeared. They found her footprints leading down to the cliffs, to the jagged rocks where the sea pounded against the shore. The fog was thickest there, churning like a living thing. Voices rose from it, calling, coaxing. Among them was their mother's voice, clear and sharp, calling Emily's name over and over. Daniel, Claire, and Marcus followed desperately, their lanterns useless in the suffocating mist. The roar of the sea grew louder, mingling with the cries. And then, at the edge of the cliff, they saw her. Emily stood poised at the brink, her arms outstretched, her eyes glassy with tears. Behind her, shapes swayed in the fog. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, their faces a blur of sorrow and hunger. Her mother stood at their front, smiling gently, beckoning her daughter forward. Daniel screamed her name, but Emily didn't turn. She took one step closer to the edge, the rocks crumbling beneath her feet. And the fog surged upward, and swallowed her whole.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe our channel, give a like and share it with others who love suspense and thrill. And most importantly, turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next chilling tale. Your support means everything,